All right, welcome to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and in this video, I am going to be refuting or responding to an evolutionist named Barry Desborough, supposedly the go-to guy on the topic of one of my favorite subjects, endogenous retroviruses, the so-called best evidence for common descent or evolution, that kind of evolution that says you as a human being are related to strawberries, chimpanzees, and banana plants. Now, endogenous retroviruses, as you know, if you follow this channel, have been promoted and advertised as the single best evidence for evolution. Some have even said that although you don't prove things in science, it's about disproving hypotheses. I have heard some in the evolutionist camp argue that shared endogenous retroviral-like sequences across the biological world that fall out into nested hierarchical patterns are as close to proof for something as you can get. And Barry, apparently he is the go-to guy on the topic of ERVs. And rather than debate me or have a discussion with me in a formal setting, online, for example, he would prefer to go back and forth in an ongoing video debate series. And I'm happy to do so, especially in light of the fact that I have recently published the superior model in explaining endogenous retroviruses. This right here is the updated and expanded Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, Dismantling the Best Evidence for Common Descent. I have several new appendices at the back of this book that go into all the details, all of the material associated with my active research project over the last 2 or 3 years since I've published my first book. And in these appendices and in presenting the superior model, because at Stand for Truth Ministries, we don't just like to refute arguments for evolution. We want to model build. Model building is important. We want to answer challenges, answer objections, refute evolution, but also offer a superior model or explanation for the data and evidence that we discuss so frequently with those of the opposite side. And so I've offered just that, the superior model, in my updated and expanded version of the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. And many, if not all, of Barry's arguments that he presents in a video and in several of his articles on his website, I answer directly through the superior model, specifically segregated design. We'll discuss segregated design a little bit in this video, but I suspect this will be ongoing because I will be responding to Barry's video, and then apparently he will be responding to this, and we'll kind of go from there. I think this initial response to set the foundation will be a bit longer. I'll make sure to give Barry a lot to deal with as I have several other projects that I'm working on, including the Australopithecine question. I'm still working on my hominin fossil record model, and I have another episode in my ongoing series answering the Australopithecines to record and hopefully publish within the next several days. And so I will offer up quite a bit of material here for Barry to interact with and to digest as he works towards refuting my points. Now, before we get into addressing his video, a little bit of housekeeping here. Last week was excellent. I had a ton of fun. We had back-to-back seminars that just blew me away in terms of how detailed, how comprehensive, and rigorous these events were. We started off with Dr. Tim Clary, creationist geologist from Institute for Creation Research, the truth about the global Genesis flood. If you are an objective thinker and you don't believe in the worldwide flood described in the Bible, and you watch this program, we went for almost 3 hours. We did it live. We addressed dozens, it appeared to be dozens, of critics, comments, challenges, and objections. Dr. Clary is a wealth of information. He's truly a blessing, and I really enjoyed this program. It's rewatchable. I went through the entire program again, studied it thoroughly, and I recommend you guys do the same because it is a great time to be a biblical creationist and therefore utilize the material that we have for you guys. Then the very next day, we went for another 3 hours, so 6 hours worth of evolution, deep time, dismantling content in 2 days with two PhD scientists, Dr. Tim Clary, a PhD geologist, and Dr. Andrew J. Fabich, a PhD microbiologist. The genetic case for evolution collapses. If you haven't yet seen this program, again, we did this one live. We interacted with challenges, objections, criticisms. We engaged the critics, and we addressed the best so-called evidence for common descent. We had a goal. It was my mission to give you guys a single go-to video that addresses in detail for 3 hours, for example, the length of this program, all of the evolutionists' favorite talking points. And I'm talking about informed evolutionists. We engaged nested hierarchical patterns in DNA. We addressed and debunked phylogenetic systematics, endogenous retroviruses, pseudogenes, chromosome 2 fusion, the so-called best examples of beneficial mutations like Lenski's E. coli, nylon digestion by bacteria, novel lizard placentas. Guys, this is a must-watch program, and I'm very happy with how these two events turned out. Okay, let's get into the fun. I am going to screen share, and we will begin to play Barry's video right here. VIGES, VIGES. Variation-inducing genetic elements is what that stands for. And he calls his video Creationist Desperation over Endogenous Retroviruses. In our debate last month on Modern Day Debate, Are Humans and Chimps Related? From my understanding, Austin Sims, he focused heavily on ERVs. Spaghetti Flying Auditor a little bit. I refuted all their points, engaged their challenges, questions. I posed a lot of my own challenges, which all of them were dodge. That's what evolutionists do best. Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. The 5 Ds of evolutionist dodgeball. And these same challenges I am going to be presenting to Barry, several of them in this video, and we'll allow him to deal with those, and then we'll present several more in follow-up videos. Austin Sims has come up with a list of challenges and questions, and I'm assuming that they originated from Barry. I could be wrong on that, but I've seen Barry ask a lot of the same questions. I saw him present those same questions and challenges in the comment section of that debate. I pointed him to the debate itself that he was commenting on, showing that these arguments, for the most part, were addressed, but I am going to be reiterating a lot of those points, answers, and more. Anyways, we have set the foundation. Let's get into his video. And let's double check here that the audio is shared. It is. Okay, guys, sit back. This is going to be fun. I love responding to the critics on ERVs. As a matter of fact, I just recently responded to the entire short that Flying Spaghetti Auditor put out, point by point. I do not expect Spaghetti to respond to my response, because him responding to my response would mean that he actually has to address my questions and challenges, which he will never do because he can't. Because these challenges, evolutionists have no good answers to, so they have to ignore, they have to avoid, they have to dodge. Here we go, guys.
In the war in defense of scientific knowledge against creationists, There is hardly any more certain evidence of common.
See, already starting. There's no more certain evidence for common descent. I love how he says the war against creationists, that we have a war against science, when in fact it's those like Barry who believe that non-living chemicals somehow billions of years ago organize themselves into the first self-replicating molecule, and then you get single-cell to multi-celled evolution, and you get the evolution of your first fish to amphibian to reptiles to mammals, and then eventually to man. Okay, this right here, this idea that all life, including plants and animals, whales and strawberries, are related through common ancestry, this is the pseudoscientific belief. This is what's going to war against real empirical science, okay? Because as you guys have seen through the content on this channel, as you guys will see throughout these video responses, it is the creationist starting point that best explains what we see in terms of scientific evidence.
Ancestry than that from endogenous viruses, ERVs for short. I will give a brief summary now, but much more detail is available via the links in the video description below.
To understand why retrovirus DNA is such a big deal, let's first take a quick look at what retroviruses.
Now, I do want to point out he is citing Stated Clearly's video here. I have responded in detail to his first video, and then he actually, believe it or not, years ago, he responded to portions of our response that we did years ago. Anyways, his larger video on ERVs, which Barry in a Facebook group the other day, he was promoting that video put out by John Perry, or Stated Clearly, and I put out a 3-part response responding to many of John Perry's points in that video. His video was meant, John Perry that is, meant to show undeniably or irrefutably that endogenous retroviruses really are the ancient vestiges or remnants of past viral infections. And I showed that every single one of his points, for the most part, his last few points I addressed in other videos and articles and in my book, because to address those required the superior model, which I presented, and Barry will be now forced to engage. Anyways, I showed why no, all of his points were not irrefutable points to suggest that ERVs really have come from exogenous retroviruses. Okay, let's continue here. That's to point out the fact that this right here is a visual from one of John Perry's videos. RNA viruses that reverse transcribe their genomes into a host DNA, retroviruses, right? You got DNA transcribed into RNA, translated into a protein. Retroviruses, which have an RNA genome, RNA genetic material, they can reverse transcribe. They have an enzyme, reverse transcriptase, and therefore, rather than DNA to RNA, they can go RNA to DNA.
Bizarre. A retrovirus is a special type of virus that reproduces by inserting its genes directly into a cell's DNA. The virus genes become a seamless, permanent part of the host cell's genome.
Right off the bat, I'll ask this question. Barry is going to be, it is necessary that he answers this question that no evolutionist has sufficiently answered. What came first, the retrovirus or the host? Because retroviruses actually require a host to replicate. So if the retrovirus apparently came first, where's the host? Where's the host cell? How does it replicate? If you say the host genome or the cell came first, well, now you've just entered the world of the creationists. You've entered my world, where I explain the true origin of exogenous retroviruses as coming from host genomes, pre-existing cells, through the escapee hypothesis, which many, even in the conventional literature on viruses, I've heard well-respected virologists point out the same thing, that exogenous retroviruses essentially originated from LTR retrotransposons adopted in ENV, which is an envelope protein, to assist them in moving around the genome, and eventually moving to other species where that species can't regulate that virus. It's harmful. It burns hot and fast, so on and so forth. So anyways, Barry, to counter a lot of what I am going to say in this response and future responses, if necessary, he needs to answer that question.
The cell treats the virus DNA as if it were its own. It reads the virus genes, using them to make new viruses. And when the cell copies its own DNA before reproducing, it also copies the virus DNA and passes it on as well.
Retroviruses, HIV is an example, replicate by integrating a copy of their genomes with the DNA of the cells of the host organisms that they infect.
To be clear, HIV is an exogenous retrovirus. So think of exogenous as occurring from outside, external or horizontal. If somebody transmits HIV, which is an exogenous retrovirus, it's transmitted horizontally. Endogenous, occurring from within rather than externally. And so if you have an endogenous retrovirus, that is because an exogenous retrovirus infected in the right way, which would be in a germ cell, okay, egg or sperm cell in a reproductive line, and it was passed on vertically rather than horizontally, vertically. And so now the offspring, the progeny, will have that endogenous retroviral DNA.
The host cells then read the integrated viral DNA and make more viruses. ERVs are the remains of viruses that have entered the host genomes of species by integrating with.
That's his assertion. The question is, are endogenous retroviruses, or as you guys are going to see, are the majority of endogenous retroviruses the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they mostly created units of DNA function? You'll see, or you probably already know if you follow this channel, as I think we have put out more videos on endogenous retroviruses than anybody, both creationists or evolutionists. We have so many videos on ERVs, so many debates on ERVs. It really is one of my favorite topics. And the question is, why would ERVs, such a technical topic, be one of my favorite topics? Is because I like to focus on what the evolutionist argues is their best evidence for common descent. That's what I specifically like to focus on. And they constantly assert that ERVs are their best, or one of their best lines of evidence. But as you've seen, over 90% of ERV sequences, so you have ERVs, full-fledged ERVs would comprise LTRs on either side, so long terminal repeats. You got your GAG, your POL, your ENV components, okay? Your ENV is your envelope protein. And with these is where you get the coding for integrase, for example, which is how the retrovirus integrates into the host system and into the host cell. And then you've got reverse transcriptase, of course, to perform reverse transcription. But your full-fledged ERVs, there's only a few of them that are shared between humans and chimps. The majority of them actually do not represent full-fledged endogenous retroviruses. Okay. They actually comprise solo LTRs, long terminal repeats. And we now know, based on many papers on this issue, that solo LTRs serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. And so where the evolutionists like Barry is going to say, well, we share thousands with chimpanzees, great apes, and primates, when in fact, the majority of those are solo LTRs, which I can argue justifiably based on the evidence that these are just functional stretches of DNA that have nothing to do with endogenous retroviruses, as in endogenous retroviruses that comprise your LTRs, your GAG, your POL, and your ENV genes. Okay. So if over 90% of so-called ERV-like sequences simply represent solo LTRs, why in the world would we call those, unless we're invoking evolutionary assumption, ERVs, when they might actually not even represent true ERVs? They might just represent functional stretches of DNA, which makes sense that we would share those with the rest of the biological world, as that is good design. Human engineers design in homologous patterns with similar features and traits and units. So why shouldn't God? Okay, I mean, we understand that ERVs can act as promoters, enhancers, or transcription start sites for gene expression. ERVs are heavily involved in the gene expression and gene regulation pathways. And so it's important to point that out when an evolutionist wants to say, well, we share thousands of these with the primates. Be like, no, evolutionist, if you're up to date on the literature, the majority of those represent solo LTRs.
Their germline DNA, the DNA in sperm or egg cells, and they have thereby become heritable. They can be passed down to offspring, just like the traits for brown eyes or red hair. When a retrovirus first enters the DNA of a sperm or egg cell, we call it endogenization, and we call the result an ERV.
And a big thing based on what he's saying here is an informed evolutionist that is up to date or informed on what I've been saying and what I argue in my book here. There are fixed ERVs, unfixed ERVs. I argue that there are created ERVs, which would have essential functional roles like the roles we know in embryological development, where ERV-derived proteins like syncytins are indispensable for placenta formation. There are papers, I have one in particular that I present, that says if we did not have ERVs, mammals and humans would not exist because of their functional role in embryological development. So of course we would share those with chimpanzees and gorillas and other creatures, because other creatures have babies too, and they require functional DNA units to assist in embryological development. And it's so funny because Barry is so known for saying, well, no full ERV is functional. It's just certain aspects of it. That would be like saying no human body, a human being is not just functional. It's not a functional unit. It's just certain parts of the human body, like the heart and the lungs and the brain that are functional. No, the human, the person, the unit, the being is a functional being. ERVs, whether a solo LTR or a full-fledged ERV, is a functional unit. As you're going to see in Barry Desborough, he isn't up to date on the literature, because there's paper after paper showing that every single aspect of the ERV, the GAG, the pole, the ENV, the LTRs, are necessary for them to carry out many of their functional roles, including in viral mimicry, in the immune system, fighting off real harmful viruses. They require their exact makeup and sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses for those operational roles. So let's just put that one to bed. ERVs regulate immune system pathways. They respond to cellular stress. They're necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. And every single aspect of the ERV is a functional component in doing that. Okay, ERV transcripts, for example, can act as viral mimics. We understand that transcribed ERVs in the cell can give the cell the appearance of being invaded by a harmful retrovirus. And so the immune system, combined with the being mediated by the P53, the guardian of the genome, incredibly designed protein, P53 protein, together they then target that cell because of viral mimicry being performed by the ERV with more destruction. Okay, and that's why cancer researchers are actually studying the usefulness of ERVs in cancer therapy. And the ERV has to look like the exogenous retrovirus to be able to perform that role.
The non-fatal ones are usually broken. That's how they can be passed down to viable offspring. Now, the essential fact to note that creationists ignore like the plague is that when a retrovirus integrates with host DNA, it cannot target any particular spot or locus in the DNA.
Now, remember, Barry at this point seems to be arguing from a position that says all endogenous retroviruses really are the ancient remnants of past viral infection. One. Secondly, there's far too many shared between humans and chimpanzees in exact genetic locations or loci for those to have been acquired independently in separate lineages. So how evolutionists argue from these basic assumptions and starting points, they will argue that, okay, since the probability is almost zero that all of these would have integrated and the infections would have taken place independently, and let's say the human and the chimpanzee line, then these must have been inherited from a past common ancestor. So they believe that humans and chimps are related through common ancestry. Chimpanzees supposedly are our closest cousin, and we can be traced back to a common ancestor roughly 6 to 7 million years ago. And after the split, you'd have the human line, the hominin line, and the chimpanzee line, or the pan line, because we know chimpanzees and bonobos are closely related. And therefore, that endogenous retroviral-like DNA did not accrue independently, but the ERVs and ERV-like units that are shared were actually inherited from that past common ancestor. And that would be a good argument against a creationist who would argue, and I've seen in the past some creationists, and I highly advise against it, some creationists have argued that shared endogenous retroviral-like sequences are really due to the independent accumulation of exogenous retroviral infections over time since the flood that have integrated by infecting a germ cell line and being passed on horizontally for the endogenization process to occur. And so Barry's argument ultimately here, okay, that he's expanding on, would be good against that position. But my position suggests that we got fixed ERVs, unfixed ERVs. So we do have true ERVs. We're going to get into that. But the ones that are shared, your fixed ERVs, your essential ERVs, especially your functional ERVs, those would be created units of DNA function.
But the vast majority of ERVs present in the DNA, for example, in humans and chimps, are in precisely corresponding loci.
Right, so you can see here on the slide right there, they're in exact corresponding locations. So to him, they could not have occurred independently or separately. They must have been inherited for that to be the case.
The only viable explanation for them is that they were endogenized in common ancestors. Common inheritance accounts for their common locations. Separate endogenizations cannot account for them.
And that's exactly what I said. So he's arguing against a creationist position, which is not my position, that would argue that all of the ERV and ERV-like sequences that we find shared between humans and chimps and the great apes in general are, they would have had to been inherited because the chances are too low. The probability is nearly impossible that they could have been acquired independently in that many exact genetic locations.
One desperate notion that creationists will appeal to is the idea that at least some of ERVs were not caused by retroviruses, but were designed into genomes to provide benefits. They call them viges, not the virus-induced gene editing of respectable science, but variation-inducing genetic elements. The idea is that maybe some of these were designed into our genomes from the beginning to be...
I'm not a big fan of the name VIGE, variation-inducing genetic element, because ERVs do so much more. We understand now that we're in 2025, almost 2026, that ERVs and ERV-like sequences do so much more than just induce variation, which is one of their benefits. But they function, as I went over a few, they function in embryological development, in the immune system, cell stress responses. They work at determining cell types. Okay. Viral mimicry is an important, a fascinating one. And so created units of DNA function, I think, serves better. And again, they require that sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses in order to carry out many of their functional roles, including fighting off viruses, acting in the immune system, viral mimicry. And then you got people like Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal, who are still repeating arguments that I've already demolished many, many times over the years. For example, in his latest video on junk DNA with Will Duffy, brother Will, Dan was saying, oh, well, Donny is wrong on his model explaining endogenous retroviruses, because we know that they are the ancient remnants of retroviral infection because of target site duplications. These hallmark signs or signatures that integrate external integration has taken place through exogenous retroviral infection. When in fact, those TSDs, target site duplications, these signatures, okay, those come about. Those are left behind. You get those same signatures from internal mobility of retrotransposons. Okay, there's various classes of retrotransposons and retroelements. ERVs are just one of them, okay? And a lot of these retrotransposons have the ability to move. They're mobile, okay? And when they move, either through cut and paste or copy and paste, a couple different ways that they can do so, and they can do so in order to turn genes on, turn genes off, induce variations. Really incredible design. They leave behind those same signatures. So Dan can't demonstrate with certainty, absolute certainty, that these signatures or target site duplications, these hallmark signs of retroviral integration, are all due to external infection. That's his assertion. That's his evolutionary philosophy. Those same marks, those same signatures are left behind due to internal mobility. And we have a lot of retrotransposons in the human genome. And so all of those DNA units, okay, the ones that have been mobile and moving around, let's say since the flood, and especially for those roughly 1,000 years after the flood, when you have faster rates of speciation, you have massive shifts in environment. We understand that environment can dictate morphology, and organisms are built with a lot of morphological adaptability, the pre-existing ability to adapt, and DNA units that assist in that are retrotransposons. And so if you have mobile retrotransposons after the flood, and a faster rate of speciation as species are moving out after the flood, after the ark, and they're venturing out into a new world, and you have these drastic shifts in environment, okay, and you have new variations coming about rather quickly because you have all these shifts in heterozygosity, which is a state of more DNA diversity or allelic variability, to levels of homozygosity, a lesser state of DNA diversity, okay? And you have these retrotransposons doing their jobs. Well, then you're going to have a lot of these signatures being left behind that Dan is going to interpret as being due to external infection, when in fact these signatures, these hallmark signs, are being left behind due to internal mobility.
Reintegrated in different parts of our genomes, rather like an unfolding puzzle. Yes, elements of ERVs do provide benefits, but never a complete, undamaged, functional retrovirus. They would be fatal.
So we do get damaged and harmed retroviruses, especially because of the redundant nature of retroviruses. Some of them might not be preserved or conserved through natural selection, because you have some ERVs and ERV-like units that have more essential roles, let's say in embryological development. And so if you have a mutation there, then the organism will not live or exist to propagate and pass on their genes. That's natural selection, basically, differential reproduction, who's reproducing the most. And so due to the redundant nature of retrotransposons and ERVs and ERV-like sequences, a lot of them can tolerate a lot of mutation accumulation and error, where as some ERVs can't tolerate a lot of error. So over time, you're going to have deleterious mutation accumulation. You'll have a lot of these ERV and ERV-like sequences, or just retrotransposons in general, that are damaged due to mutations, might even lead to disease. Now, his statement there is slightly confusing, because I'm not entirely sure if what he means is that no ERV is functional in its entirety. If that's what he means, he's completely wrong. Every single aspect of the ERV is necessary to perform many of their functional roles. We understand when it comes to their functions in the immune system and cell stress responses. The ENV, for example, the envelope proteins of the ERVs function in blocking harmful viruses from entering the system. So that stops harmful viruses from negatively affecting the systems of hosts. And it's interesting because they can actually do this by binding to receptors that infectious viruses would use to enter the cells of hosts. That's incredible forward thinking that points back to the forward thinker. And so the ENV proteins actually have the potential to enter viruses, which as a result ends up disrupting the viral life cycle. What this process is doing, which again, the ERV requires their sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses to carry out these roles. But what that does is it ends up inactivating viruses before they infect new host cells. And so every aspect, the design of the ERVs are necessary to essentially heighten or amplify immune responses to the binding of very specific receptors. Of course, viral mimicry, they need to look like the virus to perform viral mimicry.
And the bits and bobs that do something useful do not have to be in the same locations in chimps and humans.
See, notice this, the bips and bobs of, no, everything to do with the ERV is necessary for them to perform their operational roles. And it just does not seem like Barry is up to date on ERV function and their essential roles, let's say in placenta formation. Because yes, ERVs shared between humans and chimps, we share a lot more. We look a lot more similar to chimpanzees than we do to a dog. So we might have more ERVs in similar genetic locations as the chimpanzee, because we actually share a lot more with the chimpanzee in terms of morphology, anatomy, and physiology. Okay, but why we share a lot of ERVs and have these shared functions with the chimpanzee and the bonobo and the gorilla and the orangutan is the same reason why all modes of transportation take two similar modes of transportation. GM makes sedans and hatchbacks. So take your Chevy Cruze, Chevy Impala, Chevy Malibu, take the different models associated with them, base levels, models, high level models, and you're going to have a lot of similarities. You're going to have engines in common. Vehicles are not going to get very far if you don't have an engine. And organisms like humans and chimpanzees aren't going to be able to reproduce, propagate without endogenous retroviruses. We are going to have weak immune systems. We are going to be more susceptible to the invasion of harmful viruses if it weren't for all of the functional retrotransposons that we have in our genetic systems that help fight off a lot of these invaders and infections. And so antiviral defense is important. We live in the same world. We share the same planet. And therefore, it makes sense that we're going to share a lot of these functional DNA units with other creatures in the biological world, like chimpanzees and great apes. Now, as everybody knows, I like to bring receipts to back up my arguments. Therefore, let's have a look at a few of these papers associated with ERV functionality. So again, as I said earlier, the important question that Barry is not asking himself, are endogenous retroviruses really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? And the papers on this topic demonstrate very soundly that ERVs are involved in tumor suppression, acting as antiviral protectors. I mentioned the fact that ERVs must look like harmful viruses to carry out several of their important functional roles. They function in determining cell types and regulating gene expression, essential in regulating early stages of human embryonic development. See, I would predict that the ERVs that are essential in things like embryonic development, those will be fixed. Those are created units of DNA function. Whereas your unfixed ERVs, where only a subset of the population, let's say in humans, have them, well, those would be the result of true endogenization, exogenous retroviruses after the flood, invading the germ cell line and being passed on vertically, becoming an endogenous retrovirus. But I would predict that those are not going to have essential roles in embryological development. Show me, Barry, how those functional roles come about. Here's several papers documenting ERV function. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in immune response, beneficial role of human endogenous retroviruses. Again, only 10% of ERVs represent the full ERVs. Over 90% of ERVs represent solo LTRs, which we discussed earlier, that these solo LTRs serve as binding sites for initiating or enhancing gene expression. I'm not making any of this up. You can find this directly in the literature. For example, here's one of my favorite papers, Switching Sides, How Endogenous Retroviruses Protect Us from Viral Infections. They admit, intriguingly, almost 90% of all HERVs represent so-called LTRs. These HERVs lost, so they assume that these over time are degenerated, essentially ERVs, where they once in the ancient past had the full-fledged ERV sequences, the GAG, POL, and ENV components. And notice what they say: evidence for their role regulating cell immune responses is growing. From this paper, the endogenous LTRs all act as enhancers and may increase antiviral gene expression in response to viral infections. So these are the receipts. I've refuted Barry's video. I got about another minute to go. We'll do that in a second. But here again are the receipts directly from the conventional literature backing up everything I've been saying during this response. Notice this from the Switching Sides paper. While many of them are usually dormant, they can be reactivated by several stimuli, including viral infections. So a lot of ERVs are simply not active because they're waiting to be called upon to initiate their pre-existing built-in functional roles, like fighting off of a viral infection, kind of like how your computer is front-loaded with antiviral programs, that if your computer is invaded with a virus externally, well, now your built-in antiviral program can deal with it. And again, this is all forward thinking, which points us back to the forward thinker who front-loaded the original created kinds, the original created archetypes, with various classes of functional retrotransposons and retroelements, ERVs being one of those. ERVs have become integral parts of immune defense mechanisms and to help fight off invading viral pathogens. These are incredible from the Switching Sides paper, because Barry likes to say, well, no full ERV in its entirety is functional. It's just little snippets of it are. It's a ridiculous argument. I think this is why Barry won't debate, because he'll be forced to defend his points in real time, and all he'll be able to do is what? Well, what we've seen in so many recent debates: dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. Apart from rather broad and unspecific immune modulatory activities, endogenous retroviral ENV, so there's that envelope protein, can also directly inhibit, this is what I was saying earlier, viral infection through a process termed receptor interference. Since exogenous and endogenous retroviruses frequently share the same receptors, see why the ERVs have to share sequence similarity with the exogenous retroviruses in order to perform their operational roles. The conventional literature itself refutes ERVs as evidence for common descent. It's not my fault that the authors of these papers, in their discussion and conclusion, invoke evolutionary philosophy to explain away these functional roles that are clearly evidence for design and separate ancestry. You need to learn how to read between the lines and critically think, which I think Barry might lack when reading these technical papers. Again, paper after paper, retroviral promoters are in the human genome. They even admit our knowledge about endogenous retroviral elements involved in cellular immune responses is constantly increasing. ENVs restricting retroviral infection in primates. This is incredible. Transposable elements have had a substantial and sometimes beneficial impact on host genomes in many ways. ERVs appear to play important roles in physiology, fetal development. Our results provide direct evidence for retrotransposons and actively shaping cell type and species-specific chromatin architecture. Guys, this is incredible. Transposable elements contribute to transcription regulation. It's all over the place. I could present for the next 4 hours on the amazing functionality of retroelements. Far from being junk DNA, directly from the secular literature. This isn't even a creationist paper. The pervasive retrotransposons that populate the genome have a powerful capacity to what? Influence genes and chromatin. ERV-H, for example, can modify the higher order 3D structure of chromatin during early primate development. How do these functions evolve and come about? Barry. Unbiased analyses. Notice this: unexpected, not predicted, but expected and predicted if common design were true. Unbiased analyses of these genomic maps have uncovered endogenous retroviruses as an unexpected ally in the regulation of human immune systems. Again, paper after paper after paper. What I wanted to do, though, is go over a bit of the superior model here. Host genomes must have existed prior to retroviruses because retroviruses require a host to replicate. To the evolutionists, to Barry, what came first, the retrovirus or the host? Harmful viruses have originated from pre-existing created retrotransposons. ERVs are not vestiges from ancient RNA retroviral infections. It is the other way around. RNA viruses have originated from the various classes of design retrotransposons. That's why you can have an unfixed ERV, because after the flood, in humans and other biological organisms like mice, for example, you can actually get true ERVs due to exogenous retroviral infection, where the infection occurs in a reproductive cell, okay, sperm or egg cell. Then you get an unfixed ERV. But the most, if we consider humans, the majority are fixed. Notice this directly from the secular literature, Origin of Viruses. They admit this. To date, no clear explanation for the origin or origins of viruses exists. Viruses may have arisen from mobile genetic elements. Wow, look at that. That gain the ability to move between cells. Exactly what my model suggests, that after the fall, specifically after the flood, I think is when a lot of this happened due to the negative shifts, the drastic shifts in environment. Due to the flood, the increased mutation rate, increased radiation rocks, for example, faster rates of speciation during that time period. After the flood, you'd have an increase in viral infections and therefore an increase in true endogenous retroviruses, which explains the unfixed ERVs. But in combination with the majority that are fixed, functional, with many being essential. And I would predict that the unfixed ERVs, they might be disease causing. They won't have essential functional roles like embryological development. Viruses might have come from broken pieces of genetic material inside early cells. These pieces were able to escape their original organism and infect another cell. In this way, they evolved into viruses. Incredible. A third prevalent hypothesis, reminder, guys, these are articles and papers from the conventional literature. What they are saying argues in favor for the model that I am presenting. The escape hypothesis suggests that viruses were once part of the genetic material of host cells. So God front loads the original created kinds with various classes of functional retrotransposons and retroelements, ERVs being one of them. They function in many ways: embryological development, they function in the immune system, they function in stress responses, tumor suppression, antiviral defense, they function in determining cell type, so on and so forth. We could go on forever and ever. But harmful exogenous retroviruses, after the fall, due to degeneration, errors in the packaging process, mutation accumulation, what you get are true infectious exogenous retroviruses that are then able to move from one host to another. When it moves to a foreign host, that host doesn't know how to regulate that invading virus, that foreign virus, and therefore it burns hot and fast, and it leads to issues, and it leads to disease. Now, before we respond to the last minute here from Barry, there were a couple more slides here that I wanted to show. Okay, fixed versus unfixed. So fixed ERVs, you're looking at about 95%. Those are going to be created. Those are going to reflect design patterns, separate ancestry. And then your unfixed ERVs, which I would predict are true ERVs. And so you need to look at segregated design, okay? The creation model, you got categories of ERVs. For the most part, you got fixed that are design, functional, universal. Unfixed, true viral insertions. Segregated design can also explain how originally fixed created ERVs or retroelements could become population specific. And I discuss and describe that all in my Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. So fixed ERVs, as you can tell in the top left in the blue box, created essential functions. Then you got unfixed ERVs, true viral insertions, rarely functional. So critics like Dan and Barry, if you want to refute me on ERVs, you have to actually address the model that I am putting forth. Okay? And here are some challenges that I want to show Barry. Firstly, I'd love for him to address the details of this fascinating paper that I've discussed very significantly over the years, where they admit that long disregarded as junk DNA or genomic dark matter, endogenous retroviruses have turned out to represent important components of the antiviral immune response, where they have to look and share that sequence similarity with exogenous retroviruses to carry out those important roles. Notice this. This is incredible. Right from the conventional literature. ERVs appear to play important roles in physiology, fetal development, and notice how they say human evolution. That's their evolutionary philosophy. They got to stick in and insert evolution-based assumptions. What they actually mean is ERVs, they can help to induce genetic variation. And that works perfectly with design diversity and created heterozygosity. But they want to call any kind of change and variation human evolution. But the most important here, notice this: if the accidental infection, there they go, assuming an infection took place, of a mammalian ancestor by an exogenous retrovirus had never occurred, they admit this right here. The placenta and the mammals that produce it, including humans, would have never existed. I like to exist. I hope Barry likes to exist. The viewer, you like to exist. And so why do we share endogenous retroviruses like these that are functional and active in embryological development with the rest of the biological world, like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, great apes, lesser apes, it's because we all need functional DNA units to assist and to help in embryological development. Okay, I want to move to some of these challenges that I really hope Barry can answer. We've been comprehensive here. Barry, what is the evolutionary pathway by which an LTR evolved? If he thinks he can present a better model than I can, we've gone over the basics, introductory level explanation for segregated design, explaining fixed and unfixed ERVs. Another important point too, let's say we look at other animals in the animal kingdom. Take mice. Well, we've discovered what appears to be unfixed ERVs and retro elements in mice that actually act in the immune system and in the immune response. Well, that's fascinating, but it makes sense because if exogenous retroviruses originated from pre-existing, designed, and front-loaded retro elements, LTR retrotransposons. So these originate from the host cell, the host genome, and they move to another species. Okay, well, after the flood, you'd have animals moving out first before humans do. Humans congregate at Babel before God confuses the languages, and then people spread out to all parts of the globe. Okay, well, you have animals that move out first, and you have animals like mice that propagate quickly, fast reproduction times, exist in large populations, and due to actual viral infections, where the exogenous retroviruses originated from host genomes, they're taking those pre-existing functions with them, and they selfishly invade another host. So, for example, you get an unfixed ERV in a mouse. A mice population has unfixed ERVs, and those ERVs have decided to move in, and now they need to take care of the host that they're living in, much like a squatter moves into a house. And maybe after a long period of time, because they're living there, they don't own the house, it's not their house, but they decide to tidy things up, maybe fix a few things because it makes for better living conditions. Okay, so these ERVs have those pre-existing functions with them because they originated from exogenous retroviruses, which originated from created host DNA elements. Well, one of those functions that are pre-existing has to do with cell stress responses and acting in the immune system. And therefore, these unfixed ERVs are now assisting these mouse populations by fighting off other invading viruses that they don't want to move in and invade and integrate. Okay. And so we have a very elegant and sophisticated explanation for all of these different observations. And this is why it's incredible that we've not only demolished ERVs as evidence for common descent, we've offered a superior model. Barry, what is the evolutionary pathway by which an LTR evolved? LTRs contain enhancer modules, promoter architecture, transcription factor binding clusters, chromatin opening signals, integration motifs. Show the mutation by mutation pathway. Barry, if what I'm saying is wrong, answer these questions. How did the preloaded regulatory functions inside ERVs arise in the first place? Why do evolutionists claim vertebrates borrowed regulatory functionality from viruses, but never explain how the viruses evolved that regulatory functionality? How does random viral insertion produce coordinated developmental timing? Don't just assert co-option. I don't care about your evolutionary philosophy, Barry. I want an answer that is empirical, that is science-based. For example, ERV activation right at the moment of implantation. What are essential ERVs fixed? Why are essential ERVs fixed across the species while non-essential ERVs are polymorphic? This matches the model that I'm proposing, design plus corruption, not random insertion plus co-option. If co-option explains fixed ERVs, why don't we see ongoing examples of unfixed ERVs being co-opted into essential? I'm talking about essential embryological functions today. Barry, can you point me to one paper, just one, that directly demonstrates ERV regulatory functions evolving stepwise over time? Why does the literature describe ERV contributions to regulation, Barry, but never documents the origin of that regulatory complexity? See, these are the kinds of questions that in a formal or informal debate, I would be holding Barry's feet to the fire. And I would be making sure that he is at least attempting to answer these challenges like I have addressed his challenges and his questions. Barry, if ERVs already contain regulatory elements when they insert, how does that demonstrate the evolution of new, novel regulatory functions? Those ERVs already had the regulatory elements when they insert in the first place. Can you explain how the LTR evolved its regulatory parts before insertion? Barry, it's not about function, it's about origin. You must answer, where did ERV regulatory machinery come from? LTR promoters, enhancer modules, TF binding clusters, chromatin opening elements, orientation specific regulatory logic, integration targeting motifs. Co-option, Barry cannot explain the origin of what is being co-opted. Let's stop there. I got more challenges and questions, but these are more than enough for Barry to attempt to answer. Let's finish off his video here, and then we are going to call it a day.
The Vige idea is a great example of a violation of parsimony. In the words of Sir...
Actually, as we just seen, based on all these dozens of papers in the technical literature, the number of questions and challenges that I've presented for Barry that are going to keep him busy, I'm sure, the most parsimonious answer is that the majority of these ERVs and retro elements are created units of DNA function, because Barry can't show us a pathway by which these designed elements evolved. I want to see a step-by-step pathway, not evolutionary philosophy, not storytelling. And so Barry makes a lot of assertions here, invokes a lot of storytelling, but I'm not seeing a lot of science.
Isaac Newton, we are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances.
And the separate ancestry, special creation, segregated design model best explains the observations associated with ERVs and other retro elements.
Therefore, to the same natural effects, we must, as far as possible, assign the same causes.
Barry has not addressed any of these challenges, any of these points that contradicts very powerfully and overwhelmingly his idea of what these ERVs represent.
But besides being unnecessary, Viges don't even provide a viable explanation at all. The real stakes in the heart...
Again, I want to say we're in 2025, so the Vige title, I don't think works as well as created units of DNA function, because these ERVs and ERV-like sequences have an incredible variety of functional roles, one of them being involved in generating variation and diversity. That's great, but so many other functional roles as well.
This idea are: one, the reintegration would be performed by the retroviral enzyme integrase, which, as has been proven, cannot target specific
integrase, reverse transcriptase, everything to do with the ERV is required for them to carry out their functional roles. Retrotransposons and mobile genetic elements require these enzymes as well to move around the genome. Okay. And so again, their design, the enzymes associated with them, their sequence similarity to exogenous retroviruses are necessary for their operational roles. So nothing in this video that Barry has said has demonstrated that common descent best accounts for shared endogenous retroviral-like sequences in the biological world. He needs to try a lot harder than this.
DNA loci, however many ERVs could have been Viges, and however many are supposed to be reintegrations, the Vige idea cannot possibly explain the common locality of the reintegrations in the two species.
The model that I put forth, segregated design, the escape hypothesis for the origin of exogenous retroviruses, my explanation for fixed and unfixed ERVs and retrotransposons in general. This model explains everything we see in terms of the design aspects of ERVs. It explains target site duplications. It explains everything that Barry asserts we can't explain. No, I've explained it, which is why now the ball is in Barry's court and any other evolutionist for that matter to answer the challenges and questions that I have presented.
And two, we have proof that ERVs are not designed in parts of genomes. The koala retrovirus, KORV, makes that clear.
All this is showing, Barry, is exactly what I've described with segregated design, the escape hypothesis, fixed versus unfixed ERVs. Okay, yeah. And it's interesting that we have true endogenous retroviral infections right now in the koala genome, but your pre-existing ERVs are actually being observed to block these harmful viral infections and to stop viral integration, functioning like genomic antivirus software. So here we go in real time, an example of my model in action, where you have pre-existing designed fixed functional ERVs that are actually working to block harmful viral integration. These unfixed ERVs that we see in the koala genome, or these exogenous retroviruses that are working to infect the germ cell line, okay, and be passed on vertically, the created and designed functional fixed ERVs are actually working against that. So no, this is not proof, Barry, for your model.
It is a retrovirus currently endogenizing in koalas.
Exactly. That's what I said, that this is possible. This is why we make predictions on fixed versus unfixed ERVs. This also goes back to the bigger question, the origin of retroviruses in general. Barry, let me ask again, what came first, the retrovirus or the host? Because the retrovirus requires a host to replicate in the first place. I also presented a number of challenges and questions that if Barry wants to respond to what I've presented in this video, he really needs to get started at putting in the work to address those challenges.
With no Vige insight. Please see the links below for more info.
Okay, well, there we go. We've responded to all of his points, and I had fun doing so. I have more slides and points that I want to address, but what I want to do is keep this video around an hour. It's a little bit over an hour. This should be more than enough material and information for Barry to interact with and engage. I've got several articles on the topic that goes into what I call the superior model in more detail. I've also got, again, the several new appendices in my updated and expanded book on ERVs. I've also given a two-part lecture series titled The Definitive Talk on Endogenous Retroviruses, where I cover a lot of what I've covered in this video, but in more detail. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video dismantling yet again endogenous retroviruses, the so-called best evidence for evolution that no longer belongs to the evolutionist, but actually belongs to the creationist, and turns out to represent some of the best evidence for design and special creation. God bless you all. Standing for Truth is signing off.